Move your career further, faster in just 2 days with a Harvard Professional and Executive Development Program. Advance your leadership skills, craft smarter business strategies, build your network, and transform how you work and think to keep your career moving forward. You'll earn a certificate and can add Harvard to your resume with Harvard Professional and Executive Development. Learn more at professional.dce.harvard.edu/Spotify.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. You ready? Take the position.
Kneel before Zod!
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow, films manage to get made. In each regular episode of Film Stories, this is a regular episode of Film Stories, I tell the tales of two different films and I tend to get on with it rather quickly. No difference here. I'm going to set up the first of the two films I'm talking about with a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the tail of it, the other side of this.
Superman 2. The adventure continues with the three villains from Krypton. Each one with the same powers as Superman. Each one dedicated to violence against mankind.
Think of it. 3 supervillains. Or 4 if you count him twice.
The adventure continues in Paris with Lois Lane.
I believe this is your floor.
And the romance continues. The adventure continues in Washington. The world is on the brink of destruction.
Superman, can you hear me?
And Metropolis is in ruins.
Strap in then, this one's quite the tale. We're talking about, as you probably guessed by that trailer that covered all bases really, we're talking about 1980s Superman 2, credited in the end to Richard Lester, screenplay by Mario Puzo, David Newman, Leslie Newman, Puzo's story, and starring Gene Hackman, Christopher Reeve, Ned Beatty, Jackie Cooper, Sarah Douglas, Margot Kidder, Jack O'Halloran, Valerie Perrine, Susanna York, Clifton James, E.G. Marshall, Mark McClure and Terence Stamp. Most of these people had been cast long before Superman 2 made it into cinemas, and so we've got to do a little bit of scene setting here because there's a whole backstory behind the Man of Steel coming to the big screen for the first time in a major motion picture. And so the original Superman film was released in 1978, but I think, as many people know, the plan from producers Alexander and Ilya Salkind was to shoot them back to back. They'd done this with a pair of movies, The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, although at the time they didn't tell the people involved that they were going to make 2 films out of them. This caused all sorts of legal ructions. And so they had to be upfront about the plan with Superman was to do 2 movies. They got the Godfather's Mario Puzo to work on a script. And so I will come to the full story of the original Superman in more detail in the future, I'm sure. But it's Superman 2 that I'm zeroing in on here. And so in January 1977, Richard Donner had been hired to direct the 2 movies off the back of the success of his previous movie, The Omen. Heard of that? What a film. Now, by this stage, a lot of pre-production work was underway. But as Donner would tell the book The Director's Take One from Robert J. Emery in an interview, he was told that it was all but pretty much ready to go. He had 11 weeks preparation before the shoot began. It turned out it wasn't ready to go. They had to sort out all the flying sequences, a whole backstory and a half there. There was also a massive script. It was coming in originally at around 550 pages, and that needed to be halved. I mean, 550 pages is what, 9 hours of screen time if you do the old one page per minute? I think my maths just about holds there. And so Tom Mankiewicz came in to do a rewrite on that. And with Christopher Reeve cast in February 1977, this big starry cast also had Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman on board, getting the big bucks. And the original photography stretch of Superman in Pinewood, primarily in Pinewood in the UK, was a 19-month shoot that would wrap up in October 1978. It ran a long way over, and it was over budget as well. And so the Salkinds, who were originally independently producing it, they brought in Warner Brothers as a studio partner to get the funds, really, to get this really expensive film off the ground. But what was happening during the production was the relationship between the Salkinds and Richard Donner was breaking down, and this was pivotal to where Superman 2 would end up. And so I think it was in the middle of 1977 that the Salkinds brought in some degree of an intermediary, Richard Lester. Now, Lester was not on great terms with the Salkinds. He was the director of The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, and only found out too late that he was actually making 2 films rather than 1. And so he contended that they owed him money, and there was some degree of legal fallout there. But the Salkinds reached out to him and asked him if he'd come in and do some second unit work on Superman and really be a degree of intermediary between them and Richard Donner. Now, this ended up as part of the settlement for the dispute following The Three and Four Musketeers, and so Richard Lester came on board. Now, things just simply weren't going to plan, and a decision was made, deep into that production, to halt all work on Superman 2 and to focus entirely on getting the first Superman film done. There wasn't really looking like enough money to do 2 films back to back, even though an awful lot of Superman 2 had been shot. And so with costs escalating, the emphasis turned entirely to the first Superman film, and they would come back and sort out Superman 2 later. In fact, they would end up taking the ending that they'd planned from Superman 2 and putting it at the end of Superman 1. So, just in terms of simply scripting, as soon as the first Superman movie was out, they were going to have to come back to the second one and sort out what to do with, how it concludes. Now, there were there's various sources that tell you slightly different things as to how much of Superman 2 was actually shot by the time the first Superman came out. You can have any number really between 50 and 75% of it, and you'll get someone seemingly saying that amount of time. It was clear that a substantive amount had been done, however, and what it meant was the Salkinds, when Superman the movie debuted in December 1978, knew that they had a sequel pretty much ready to go. Most of it, a good chunk of it done, again, depending which source that you kind of were listening to at that point. But there was just the small matter of those tensions and the fact that Superman 2 was still going to require a fair amount of work to finish. Now, it's also worth noting, we're in an era now where audiences will tend to wait 2-3 years for a follow-up and still turn out. In the case of something like Top Gun Maverick, decades and they'll still turn out. Sequels in the 70s and 80s were still not really the done thing. That there was some successful ones. Jaws 2 is a good example of that. But the idea was, if you're going to do a second second film, get it out fast while it's still in the audience's mind. The Police Academy series got this down to an absolute T. Just keep cranking them out. And so from the studio point of view, they would want Superman 2 as fast as possible, but there were practicalities here and there were also tensions to resolve. With Superman out and having been a huge success and made a huge amount of money and turned the previously pretty much unknown Christopher Reeve into a worldwide star, the Salkinds thus turned their attention at speed to Superman 2. It would be fair to say that Richard Donner's press tour for the original Superman film had done little to build any bridges. It was in December 1978 that a Variety reporter, Ami Uchard, had a chat with Richard Donner about the success of Superman, and in the course of that conversation, Donner appeared to issue some degree of ultimatum that his relationship with producer Pierre Spengler was pretty much gone, and Donner just basically said if Pierre Spengler was going to be on Superman 2, he wasn't going to be a part of it. Now, one of the reasons that, the Salkinds had looked at removing Richard Donner from the first Superman film, but Warner Brothers, which was putting its funds in, was liking the footage that it saw and basically all but insisted that the studio stuck with him. Now the Salkinds had a success under their belt, and now they had just a little bit more wiggle room at this point. While Warner Brothers would have influence over the decision of the director, what they didn't have was absolute authority, and in March 1979, the Salkinds sent a telegram to Richard Donner basically firing him from Superman 2. Another director was going to come in and finish the film. To say this went down badly with the cast was no understatement whatsoever. Gene Hackman famously would have absolutely nothing to do with the shoot from that point on, that they wanted to get him back to shoot new scenes as Lex Luthor. No, absolutely not. Christopher Reeve had less power, but was similarly angry. And he gave an interview that was pretty scathing. I think it was with Time Out, where he described the Salkinds as outright devious. Now, there's a terrific book on all of this by Mark Miller, by Jake Rosson, with a bit of Mark Miller in it as well, called Superman vs. Hollywood: How Fiendish Producers, Devious Directors and Warring Writers Grounded an American Icon. I do recommend the book enormously, and you get even more on Superman 2 than I'm giving you here. But it was through that book I found out that Margot Kidder had also gone to People magazine, and her quote there was, "If I think someone is an amoral a-hole," what does that say? Don't know. "I say so," she said. Margot Kidder wasn't happy. Christopher Reeve wasn't happy. Gene Hackman wasn't going to go back to it at all. Marlon Brando was already cheesed off, it should be noted. He'd taken a very, very rich deal to appear as Jor-El in the original Superman's father, but he was taking legal action against the Salkinds on a financial matter unrelated to the Richard Donner, Richard Lester situation, so he wasn't coming back for filming either. Ilya Salkind would come to try and defend his position, and he would say in an interview that the names we've been called have been really depressing. He said, "This is a very simple decision. The man didn't want to work with us. We made the film, we took the risk, and we worked for 3 years before he came in." Of Richard Donner, he said he was absolutely fantastic. He came up with brilliant things. He's a fantastic director. But my father and I controlled the picture. Well, at that stage, absolutely, yes, they did. Donner was out, Richard Lester was in, and the queue of people not wanting to come back and work on the film was growing. So there was still the script that needed work on it. Tom Mankiewicz, the plan was, let's get him back and he can sort this ending out. But when Richard Donner was gone, so was Tom Mankiewicz. He wasn't going to come back at all, in spite of attempts by Warner Brothers as well, just to basically try and persuade him to do so. Also, it should be worth pointing out, the Jeffrey Unsworth couldn't come back to shoot the film due to his tragic death, and so in came a new cinematographer to finish the movie off. That would be Robert Painter. John Williams too wouldn't come back and do the music, but I'll come to that bit of the story just shortly. So it got to the point where we're heading to the summer of 1979. Superman is still a success. It's rolling out. It's about to start rolling out on video as well. Imagine that. And so they needed to rework this script. Now, the Salkinds didn't want to bring Marlon Brando back anyway. The plan had been that his character would have a notable part in the second film, but I mean, Brando was demanding a cut of the net profit. So if they put one frame of footage of Brando in Superman 2, then that would require, I mean, at the very least, Brando would come after them with a legal claim. So the stuff involving Superman talking to his father was changed to Superman talking to his mother, played by Susanna York, who was hired back to shoot some more sequences, much to the frustration, actually, of Tom Mankiewicz, who just basically said that doesn't make anywhere near as much sense. It was David Newman and Leslie Newman who came in to rework Superman 2's script, and I mean, it led to changes. A new scene was written for the start of the film involving the Eiffel Tower, for instance. There were other parts of retooling. There was the new ending that needed to be sorted out as well. And so, there was also the director's chair. I mean, we know that Richard Lester took it on. Even before he agreed to direct the rest of Superman 2, an offer had gone out to Guy Hamilton, who worked on several James Bond films, had been talked about for the original Superman, but was double booked. And Warner Brothers wanted some consistency. It didn't want to bring in someone completely different. So Warner Brothers agreed that Richard Lester would be the person to direct the film. The Salkinds were happy. And Lester wasn't really a comics person at all. He didn't come to this with foreknowledge of Superman, but he did come to it with foreknowledge of the appreciation of a nice check, in fairness to him. Warner Brothers offered a reported $500,000 fee, and Lester, as I would be, was quite a fan of $500,000, and so he agreed to finish the picture. Now, I mean, they were heading back to the start of production again, that the script work was going on for completion over the summer of 1979. Christopher Reeve, meanwhile, he was off making something else. He slotted in a picture called Somewhere in Time, and I mean, the start date for Superman 2 kept changing. I mean, it was just being delayed. And it got to the point where legal letters were exchanged telling Christopher Reeve that you have got to be there, that there was some to and fro about whether he would be fired or not. But in the end, I mean, Christopher Reeve was now a star. He was then and would be forevermore associated with the role of Superman. And so his contract was redone. And it got to the point where as soon as one film was done, as he wrote in his book, Still Me, that when the film, his words, when the filming of Somewhere in Time was completed in August 1979, I bid a fond farewell and immediately returned to London to begin filming, again, Superman 2. Because that rest of production began, August, September 1979. And, I mean, there was also different personnel behind the scenes because of some of the delays involved, that some of the crew were now working on another film shooting in the UK, The Empire Strikes Back. You ever heard of that? And so the team behind the scenes, there were alterations. And then we come back to, depending which report you go with, there was a good chunk of the film already shot. But Richard Lester's tonally a different director to Richard Donner, and Lester wanted to lean more into the comedic. His shooting style was slightly different as well. He would shoot with 3 cameras, something not every actor was particularly keen on. They didn't know, it wasn't always clear to them. One or two of them would say which camera was on them at any time and just how to give their performance, really. There were several units going at once. The clock was ticking, that there was this constant fear from the studio that interest in Superman would wane after several months if you didn't get another film, or at least signs of another film, going. Susanna York came in, Marlon Brando didn't come in, Gene Hackman held true to his threat not to be involved in the film, and so they still needed new Lex Luthor material, so they had to bring in a stand-in for fresh material. And then when it came to adding his voice, they got a voice double to add voiceover work in the edit, to basically someone mimicking Gene Hackman's performance. There were one or two who came back into the film as well who were just simply puzzled. Now, it's worth noting that Superman 2 hinges on 3 brilliant villains who'd been cast: Jack O'Halloran, Sarah Douglas, and of course Terence Stamp. And the onus very much had switched now onto these 3 supervillains as the focus of the film. And, they didn't have Lex Luthor, did they? And various elements were out. And so the onus was switched even more onto them. And Sarah Douglas, who, she played Ursa, one of those three villains, and she was reflecting back in 2020 in an interview with Yahoo about coming back onto the set and not quite seeing what had happened instantly. She just said, it was very strange. And she said, because I was English and because it was shot in England, all the Americans, they were on location. So they all went home in the evenings to their respective hotels and they all hung out with Richard Donner. Sarah Douglas said, I just went home to Shepherd's Bush. And so I didn't socialise in the way they all did. And she reconciled that they were all very aware of what was going on. But I can honestly say I was completely oblivious. Now, I do want to know, Richard Lester sometimes comes out badly in stories of Superman 2, but go back to Christopher Reeve's wonderful book, Still Me, and he says, he's very praising of what Richard Lester walked into there. And said, I liked him tremendously, but he did note, I thought it was unfair to ask such an accomplished director to imitate the tone and style of someone else's work. Nevertheless, he succeeded in bringing his own brand of humour to it. One thing he also did, and this was thrown into focus by what happened a little bit later on with Superman 2, is he took some of the stuff that Richard Donner had shot out of the picture altogether. Some of it he went back and reshot, just with a slightly different tone and a slightly different onus to it. And so it was fashioned a lot more of his film, even though a lot of Richard Donner footage inevitably ends up in the film. You can go on the internet, you will find detailed lists of the stuff that Richard Donner shot that ended up in the cinematic cut of Superman 2. Well, Richard Lester was reworking good chunks of it anyway, and it's a bit of a cocktail, a bit of a jamboree that you get in the end. Filming wrapped up in March of 1980. And if you think about it, it effectively started all the way back in 1977. That's when some of the first footage was captured. And here we were, three and a bit years on? Over the course of the shoot, the physique of the actors had changed. There are inevitably, given how much later some chunks of Superman 2 were shot compared to the earlier stuff, physical differences, continuity errors, just little inconsistencies in the film. But it got to the point where they were pretty much unavoidable, really. This was not also a cheap film to do. This was the budget of Superman 2 was put at about $50 million in the end, although inevitably it's tied again into the original Superman, which was a similar budget, and the whole idea, make these things together. Even by the standards of that time, though, that was an enormous amount of money. A few years later, Gremlins would be made for a fifth of the price. That's the kind of level we're at. This was huge amounts of money. This was the equivalent of Carol Co. in the 1990s breaking production budget records with Terminator 2. And here we were. And never forget, too, that the Superman movies were a massive risk. This was a massive roll of the dice. There was still then this drive. Once that footage had been captured, March 1980, how quickly can they get the film into cinemas? Warner Brothers wanted it for the summer of 1980. That would be, a year and a half after the release of the original Superman. It was already antsy with that, really. However, because filming didn't finish until that March, it was just going to be impossible to complete the film that quickly. And so, much to the unhappiness of the studio, that release date would have to be pushed back. There was also the edit going on, of course. And there was an interview Richard Donner gave a few years before he died, where he talked about how at one point he was approached to rejoin Superman 2 via a shared credit with Richard Lester. And he's not someone known for sharing credit, really, but he decided to go and take a look at some of the footage that Richard Lester had shot from the film. Apparently, as the story goes, he got a little bit through the new Eiffel Tower sequence at the start of the movie and just went. I just said, forget it, Richard Donner said. John Williams did come in originally to shoot the film. However, after a conversation with Richard Lester, the two of them, it would be fair to say, did not get on. And Williams just famously said, I can't get on with that man. and declined the chance to score Superman 2. And so in came Ken Thorne, who would also score Superman 3. He would rework some of John Williams's work, inevitably, but also fill in the bits of the score that weren't there in the first place. There was still the issue of the release date to settle, of course, and Warner Brothers was getting to the point where it was so unhappy. It was basically threatening to pull the release, and the Salkins just pushed back and just said, all right, can we shop the film round to other studios? And so it was a game of brinkmanship, really, where, I mean, the Salkins had the film that Warner Brothers wanted, and so the studio went along with that. But it did come up with an unusual release strategy for the movie in the end. Now, we're in an era where films come out around the world on the same day. I mean, we're pretty much used to that now. In the case of Superman, you would expect it by 1980 standards to come out in America first, then maybe 6 months later it would appear in the UK, that kind of thing. What actually happened was they went the other way round. That Superman 2 debuted in Europe at the end of 1980, and it opened in various territories. We didn't get it in the UK, I think it was until the spring of 1981. And then it didn't make it to America until the summer of 1981. Now, you couldn't do that in the internet age. This wasn't the internet age, but it was the burgeoning VHS age. So there was a genuine concern that people would sell bootleg VHS copies of Superman 2 in America in the month's gap between the European release and the US release. Also, I mean, would word of mouth leak? You know, would spoilers spill out into the world? I'm not even sure spoilers was a word at this point, but still, the feeling that the plot might be revealed. I mean, if you go to late 1990s way of doing that, infamously, the soundtrack album to Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, gave away a massive spoiler. It was that kind of thing that they were looking to just step aside. They didn't want people knowing what was going to happen before the film came out. However, it didn't really leak. There wasn't really that much of a problem on it. Donner, I should note, declined the opportunity to share credit in the end. And so the film went before critics. And so whereas the first Superman had the fact it was something new, and the whole idea of a man flying was a very big thing. If you go back to that first Superman film, and I saw it on the big screen for the first time since it came out last year. And the moment where Superman flies from one side of the room to the other for the first time, it's easy to forget what a massive deal that was. In cinema now, everyone bloody flies. I mean, who hasn't got a cape? Who can't zip on? It was a massive, massive deal. The novelty factor, though, had gone. And so what you had now was, what can you do with the plot? Well, I mean, the critical reviews of it were actually really quite strong again. That the core performances were particularly coming in for praise, but also these three villains. Terrence Stamp as General Zod. I mean, he's iconic now by modern standards, but even then, it was just an awful lot of fun. And so, while people poked a few holes in it, and the change of tone was slightly, well, it was certainly picked up on, there was still warmth really towards it. And also the early box office reports coming in had been strong, and I mean, Warner Brothers' fears were abated. So I mean, if we zip forward to the American release, June the 19th to the 21st, it opened up against the Cannonball Run. I mean, that's a fun film as well. Raiders of the Lost Ark had opened the week before, but Superman 2 opened with $14.1 million, an enormous amount of money by 1981 standards. If anyone's got a spare $14 million and wants to give it to me, I still happily regard that as an enormous amount of money as well. But Superman 2, I mean, basically, even as the week after out came, it's interesting actually, the competition it was up against. There's a James Bond film, For Your Eyes Only, with Not Blofeld in. That's a whole story for another time. Stripes came out. The Great Muppet Caper came out. Dragon Slayer came out. But Superman 2 was a hit, and a hit for a long time. That it would, I mean, if we go back to, in the end, its total gross in US cinemas, Superman 2 would stack up with an overall American total alone of $108 million. It would do another $108 million outside of the US as well. if we put that side by side with the original Superman from a year and a half before, it was down. I mean, but that was the thing with sequels. The expectation of a sequel is it do about 65% of the business, and that rule was pretty much adhered to. 134 million in the US for the original Superman, 166 overseas, worldwide total $300 million. Both, though, regarded as massive hits, and the tease at the end of Superman 2 was that Superman would return with Superman 3 that Richard Lester would go on to direct. But the Superman 2 story wasn't complete because there was still the feeling that there was another film out there. And it really took the internet to give this the fuel to turn into something. Now, Richard Donner just went completely the other way for many years. He was quite bruised by his Superman experience. It took him a couple of years to make it. So he had, first and foremost, he decided to have a break, which is not a particularly unwise move. And then he went on to make a film called Inside Moves, which came out in 1980, which is almost like the forgotten Richard Donner movie, a much smaller piece that's well worth digging out. And then he had that incredible run in the 80s, things like the Goonies, things like the Lethal Weapon films as well. But there was no interest at all from Warner Brothers. There's no interest from Richard Donner. Just going back to Superman, it just wasn't really considered. However, the DVD market came along in the late 1990s, and people were suddenly spending more money than ever on home entertainment. And fan interest began to grow in seeing just what Richard Donner would have done with the film. That there were certainly rumours of it, but who'd actually seen his version? Well, not even Richard Donner. He never got to finish it. Now, there were an enormous amount of reasons why this couldn't happen, but a fan campaign online, a fan petition was launched. I think it's a guy somewhere who lives near me in the West Midlands here in the UK. Got noticed. It got noticed worldwide as well. And this was a point where the internet did nice things as well as not nice things. It gained traction. And it got to the point where Warner Brothers released a statement. And it said on June the 19th, 2004, the studio responded this statement: Warner Home Video is supportive of an extended version of Superman 2 on DVD. But it wrote, there are complex legal issues that need to be resolved before the film can be re-released. Warner Home Video is presently addressing these issues. Well, that's interesting. That wasn't known at the time. But also, the other catalyst for this was a lot of the footage that Donner shot had been rediscovered in 2001 because that footage hadn't been junked, and it was one of those things where it's found there in a vault and the material was there. So if he wanted to go back to it, well, fair enough. The other blockage, though, was Marlon Brando, because, the Brando estate was still controlling of Marlon Brando, as you would expect of Marlon Brando's screen image and of how he appears in and around films. And, of course, there was that legal thing that was still going on with the original movie as well. So an abundance of problems that needed to be resolved. And until they were resolved, that footage couldn't be used. Well, Brando passed in July of 2004 at the age of 80, and I don't think it's much coincidence that the Warner Brothers statement wasn't a million miles away from that moment in time. So, what happened also in the background of all of this was Warner Brothers was rebooting Batman with Christopher Nolan for the film that would be 2005's Batman Begins, but also Bryan Singer, in 2006 was going to bring Superman Returns to the screen, and Singer wanted to use Marlon Brando footage in that film. And so Warner Brothers went in the end to the Marlon Brando estate to get the rights to finally, for the first time, use that footage that Brando had shot without fear of legal recourse. Now, that deal was done, and as a result, Warner Brothers could then go back to the estate and say, actually, if we recut Superman 2, can we get Marlon Brando footage back for that as well? And so a deal was done. And finally, there was a tangible offer that could go out to Richard Donner. Do you want to come back and finish your Superman film? And so he was involved in what would become known as Superman, the Richard Donner Cut, which was released in the end. The actual debut of it was November 2006. So what happened here was Richard Donner was involved in putting this together. However, it was not a case that he was in the editing room all the way through, because he was at this stage making what would actually turn out to be his final film, 16 Blocks. And so his energies needed to be on that. However, there's no doubt at all that what you're getting with the Richard Donner cut is something far closer to what he'd originally intended to put out had he been given the opportunity all the way back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And both cuts of the movie now sit side by side. There are extensive articles online comparing the two, and it is a film story that eventually had a sort of happy ending, that you can see both movies. And, you know, I like both cuts of them enormously. I used to watch Superman 2 on rotation as a kid, and that was the cinematic cut, so I do have a lot of affection towards that. But either way you're going to cook it, it's a prime example of how to do a sequel while not losing what made the first film so special. It took an awful lot of energy, an awful lot of arguments, an awful lot of legalities, and an awful lot of personnel turnover to get there.
Move your career further, faster in just 2 days with a Harvard Professional and Executive Development Program. Advance your leadership skills, craft smarter business strategies, build your network, and transform how you work and think to keep your career moving forward. You'll earn a certificate and can add Harvard to your resume with Harvard Professional and Executive Development. Learn more at professional.dce.harvard.edu/Spotify.
Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. My lord, have I gone on too long already? So I'm just going to do a few parish notices, starting with news of print magazines that I have for sale. Now, I love print film magazines so much that I gambled my entire career on making more of them. Film Stories magazine, issue 52, is 168 pages, leading with a massive exclusive Ridley Scott interview. And I think you'll find we've asked him very different things. I hope you find that anyway. But 168 pages gives on nice paper as well, gives us a lot of space to do a lot of things I don't think you see in other film magazines. Because it costs a fortune to put these things in newsagents, it's mainly mail order. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can order a copy there. You will also find the latest issue of the only regular film print magazine for youngsters that I know of in the entire world. It's called Film Junior. The latest issue of that, with writing from youngsters that they've been paid for as well, is also on sale, headlined by Paddington in Peru. God bless him. So those are both on sale, store.filmstories.co.uk. I do ask as well, if you like this podcast, outside of lending it your ears, for which I am hugely grateful, would you mind also subscribing at your podcast home of choice? Doesn't cost you anything. It helps me. I know it's a bit cheeky, but please, it's like one of those things that really helps independent podcasts, as does leaving ideally a hugely positive review. Really helps with algorithms and stuff I don't understand. If you really, really, really like this podcast and have a spare $14 million or any amount below or above that, if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew and put some money in the pot there, you get the podcast early and ad-free pretty much every week. And I'm also chatting to people on the Patreon chat feature, which I have newly discovered. And also you find lots of gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes as well. That's the parish notices, though. I'm going to get on with the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. This is quite a tale as well. Let me set it up with a clip from the eventual trailer, but it's not the only trailer we're going to be talking about in this chat.
From Barry Levinson, the Academy Award-winning director of Rain Man. And Robin Williams, the star of Dead Poets Society.
I'm in the mood for smoked chicken. How about you?
Comes the story of a man who makes jokes.
I'm Leslie Zebo.
Makes love.
I like you.
Well, I like you too. I think love is wonderful.
And makes toys.
How do you feel?
Woozy.
That's what we'll call the woozy helmet.
This is a little uncomfortable, though.
Well, that's supposed to go in your ear.
Oh.
And a man who makes war.
Sit down, Leslie.
I don't understand why Daddy let Uncle Leland take over Zevo Toys.
I'm moving with the idea of putting in some war toys.
You never made war toys at Zevo.
We're going to need that.
That's a flavour then of 1992's Toys, which is directed by Barry Levinson. He wrote the script with Valerie Curtin, and it stars Robin Williams, Michael Gambon, Joan Cusack, Robin Wright, LL Cool J. You also get deep in the ensemble Jamie Foxx making his feature film debut. But, I mean, he wouldn't have been able to make his feature film debut in it had Toys happened when it was originally planned to happen, because it was in the late 1970s when the idea first came to Barry Levinson for this particular picture. At this stage, he'd done stand-up comedy, I think, but he'd been writing for television primarily before picking up work as a screenwriter, working with Mel Brooks on some of Brooks's 70s movies. And then, along with his then wife, Valerie Curtin, he picked up an Oscar nomination for writing a 1979 film called And Justice for All. And so off the back of that, he was looking to push into directing feature films and finding a project that could be his debut. That project looked like it might be Toys, and this was all the way back in 1979-ish, something like that. And it was in the late 1970s that certainly the first development of the story took hold. That it was inspired by a newspaper article. And in that article, it was talking about how Russian naval intelligence was picking up secret information about American nuclear submarines by looking at the toy market. That apparently Russian intelligence was looking at the model toy kits that were going on sale and working out some of the features of the American submarines. Now, once he read that article, there was a spark in it. I mean, is there something here about how kids' toys could be used as military weapons or were being used as military weapons, or mixing these two unlikely things together into a feature? Well, it was an idea that soon got traction, and 20th Century Fox was keen. It bought the idea really quite quickly. And it got to the stage where by the start of 1980, well, this was happening. Fox was going to put up a budget of around $7 million. There was a 10-week shoot that was booked in to start in April 1980. And yeah, Barry Levinson could direct. It was going to be he and Valerie Curtin's script. And his directorial debut was off the ground, right up until the point where it wasn't. Because as the early 1980s continued, well, things weren't going too well at 20th Century Fox, and there was a change of management. And so the team that had greenlit Toys and had taken a chance on a first-time director were fired. In came the new broom, and we see this a lot when Hollywood studios change the person at the top, that they review all of the projects currently in production or in development and decide which to go ahead with and which not. And you can kind of guess where this is going, because as is their wont, the new regime, they looked at the active projects and decided that a first-time director, $7 million, no, not happening. Toys was quickly put into turnaround. Now, Levinson would go ahead in a different direction for his directorial debut, and what a film. 1982's film Diner instead. A terrific movie, that. But even as he finished that, he was shopping around Toys as another film he wanted to make. And so a company called CBS Films in 1982, well, it had an ambitious slate it was putting together. The talk in the Hollywood trades was that CBS Films was looking to make around 40 movies over the course of a couple of years, and Toys was going to be one of them. This was attempt 2 to get it off the ground. Attempt 2 also did not work because CBS Films shut down. Toys went with it. Fox now still held the rights to the film. Barry Levinson, meanwhile, was building up his career at this point. And so if you go through his filmography, he had a hit with Diner. Then he directed Robert Redford in The Natural. That did pretty well, thank you very much. 1985's Young Sherlock Holmes. I must come to that in the future. That also picked up an audience. 1987's Tin Men. That went down well. And then he really struck gold in 1987 with Good Morning Vietnam, a pivotal film in the story of Toys. So, even while he was doing all of this, and 2 films out in 1987, that's a lot of work. Even while he was doing all of this, Toys was a film he was keen to do. And the third attempt to get it off the ground, the third time it got really, really close, was when Columbia Pictures picked up an interest. Now, Columbia Pictures in 1987, this was the era where David Putnam had come over from the UK, and here Hollywood had to deal with the fact that someone who was not American was heading up a Hollywood studio. And David Putnam, it's fair to say he was treated as an outsider, and he didn't treat Hollywood as Hollywood either. It was not a match made in heaven. Much has been written about David Putnam's time at Columbia Pictures, which held up projects such as Ghostbusters 2, for instance. However, as he came into the studio, he was looking to put around 20-25 films into production, and one of those was going to be Toys. And so it got to the point where, Columbia, $20 million or so, was going to put into the picture. Yeah, let's do it. Fox, though, just had to give the rights up for that to happen and be willing to sell them on. Fox did not want to. It certainly didn't want Columbia to go and make a big success out of it. And so, it refused, really, to sell the rights. And so Levinson could not make Toys. And so, to a degree, pretty much back to square one. Fox, though, would ultimately be the company that got the whole thing moving, yet the wheels were greased by the aforementioned Good Morning Vietnam. So this film came out in December of 1987, and it would be fair to say it is the film that made Robin Williams a movie star. He got, as well as scoring his first huge box office hit, he picked up his first Academy Award nomination, Best Actor, for a comedy movie primarily, although there's a lot in Good Morning Vietnam that's not comedy. And so he was out of nowhere, even though he'd been plying his trade on television, certainly, but also on the big screen, Popeye anyone, for some time, was now instantly one of the biggest stars in the world. Now, he'd enjoyed working with Barry Levinson as well. And so the pair inevitably had the conversation about, well, what other projects have you got? Toys had come into the conversation. Williams had expressed interest in playing the lead role. Good Morning Vietnam exploded, huge hit. Fox, all right. Now that's slightly more interesting, isn't it? And then the next bit of rocket fuel, well, it wasn't Robin Williams, it was Barry Levinson, because Levinson's career, not only did he have a hit movie to his name, the next film that he made would win Best Picture at the Oscars and also become a huge hit movie. That would be 1988's Rain Man, for which he'd pick up a Best Director Oscar as well. Huge hit, acclaim, Robin Williams, Oscar-winning director. Fox was very, very interested. And so, Levinson went on to make Avalon in 1990 as well, which is part of his collection of smaller Baltimore films, which are really good. Tin Men from 87 as well. Really, really worth digging out. Really like those films a lot. But in 1990, 20th Century Fox finally gave this the green light. Yeah, and what studio wouldn't? Robin Williams, Barry Levinson, Toys. Now, what could possibly go wrong? The problem here was, even though Fox had allocated $20 million to make it, Levinson had a commitment to do another film at this point with Warren Beatty, a film called Bugsy. Now, Bugsy was not the planned film to do next, but the problem with Toys was it was going to involve an awful lot of preparation just to get to day one of shooting. I'll come to that just in a second. And so Levinson had to change the order that he did the projects in. Bugsy was ready to go the quickest, and also Warren Beatty, you wait around a long time for Warren Beatty. When he says yes, you better move, otherwise you're going to lose Warren Beatty. And so off Levinson went to make Bugsy. Now, Bugsy would also be nominated for a whole ton of Oscars. If you go down the list of what Levinson was doing at this point, Diner nominated for an Oscar, The Natural 4 Oscar nominations, Young Sherlock Holmes 1 Oscar nomination, Good Morning Vietnam Oscar nomination, Rain Man won 4 Oscars, Avalon 4 Oscar nominations. Bugsy would get 10 nominations, including Best Picture. It would pick up a couple of gongs, not the big ones. But still, I mean, this a prestige director, really. So, of course, you're going to wait around for him. It meant that in could come Ferdinando Scarfiotti. I'm sorry if you're listening to this and I've mispronounced your name, Ferdinando, but your work on toys is sublime. Because as the production designer, he would spend, about a year or so designing the sets for the film. An extraordinary amount of time for what was ultimately sold as a studio comedy. But what a look to the film. And there were going to be a lot of sets as well. In fact, I think the story is that every soundstage that Fox had on its lot in Hollywood was going to be handed over to the production of toys. It was estimated that 65 sets were used for the film in all. The budget also was threatening to balloon because now they had star salaries. Barry Levinson wasn't as cheap in 1990 as he was in 1978, if they were going to make it around then. His salary went up. Producer Mark Johnson, Levinson's a long-time producer, he was also on board. He came with a price. Robin Williams certainly came with a price. In the end, what they had to do was defer their salaries a little just to grease the wheels. But the final budget was said to be, 40, 50 million. It is one of those where you could say, with no understatement, it is on the screen. I think it was Jonathan Winters and Tracy Ullman's names were mentioned in the Hollywood trades at one point as being involved in the movie, but they didn't turn up in the final film. But it was on the 25th of February 1992, as Bugsy was in the middle of its awards run, that filming finally began on Toys. So how long's this taken? What's my maths like now? It was originally due to shoot in 1980, 12 years later, at a greater cost and with a movie star on board. Here we were going. It was not an easy shoot. However, I mean, the Los Angeles Times reported on it was just a long physical shoot. It didn't finish filming until the end of June 1992. A lot of it was on set as well, beautiful sets, but also they did a lot of location work. Los Angeles, I think it's Washington primarily as well. There's some beautiful outside stuff in there. Now, Levinson's reputation on set's generally been as quite a mellow man, but as Los Angeles Times reported, quote, he's also a man who doesn't suffer foul-ups gladly. And so it cited one. On Toys, it wrote, the most technically challenging film he has undertaken. A couple of glitches set him off. I don't know what the setting off was, but I can tell you what caused it. One flare malfunctioned 22 times, and then an inept plane crash, initially intended as a one-shot deal, required that an intricate model of New York City be rebuilt. It was a challenging, testing production. But still, June 26, 1992, the film was in the can, and the idea from 20th Century Fox was, let's get this into cinemas. A big Robin Williams comedy in cinemas for Christmas 1992. Levinson, as he was editing Toys with Stu Linder, his editor, was also working on a TV show. There was some legalities around that, actually. It was a TV show that he was doing with Warner Brothers called Polish Hill that had been scheduled to run, but Levinson was alleging, I'm only alleging, any lawyers listening, I'm just reporting what was written, that the TV show Homicide was using some of the same details and plot lines, I think you can say. Allegations were denied, but nonetheless there was threatened legalities and such like. So that was going on as well. He was also developed, even though he'd been making films back to back seemingly for a period of time, he had a couple of other projects that were set to move too. And so Levinson was a very, very busy man. But also in the approach to Toys coming out, another factor kicked in. Robin Williams scored another massive hit. That would be as the voice of the genie in Disney's Aladdin. Now, this came out a month before Toys, and all of a sudden you had two competing Robin Williams films going into the Christmas market, the first of which had gone pretty much nuclear, even though Robin Williams had pretty much set out the press tour for Aladdin. The story at the time was he was putting his energies into promoting Toys, which he absolutely did, but also unrest with Disney would come out in the years that followed. He wouldn't return for the second Aladdin film. He would come back for the third in the end. And so it was a case that when it came to sell Toys, Fox was dealing with the fact that its star had already got people into cinemas, but to see a different film, effectively. Aladdin was very heavily sold off Robin Williams. And, how on earth do you sell it? how do you sell toys? Because the one thing I've danced around here is just what toys is. And it reminds me of Joe Dante's Small Soldiers, which I'll come to in the future, which is a family film with a harder edge that is dealing with the violent nature of toys sometimes. But the film Toys overtly brings the military into it, and this was a year after the first Gulf War as well, and so it was really, really tricky. It's also the thing with Toys, it's a very hard film to get down to a single log line or tagline or something like that. How do you sell it? And as the Los Angeles Times noted in its report ahead of the release, the film is, quote, considered to be a risk of sorts. I mean, this was a 30, 40, 50 million Robin Williams blockbuster in theory, but as the LA Times said, it's unorthodox, child-oriented subject matter with an adult subtext and sensibility. Now, it was reporting that it reveals a side of Barry Levinson's work that hasn't surfaced before, but, I mean, Fox couldn't actually sell what the film was about particularly well. That wasn't where the asset was. The asset was an Oscar-winning director and a huge movie star, and that seemed to be a better story than talking about a film crossing toys with the military in the political situation that America was in at that time. I am dancing around politics so much, I'm just not going there. So, for the first teaser trailer for Toys, it did something really quite radical in that it didn't show any footage from the movie at all. Now, this isn't new. Terminator 2, famously, there is a trailer for that, which is footage that's shot particularly for that film, but it is in the world of that film. What the trailer that Fox put out for Toys, the first teaser, just did was put Robin Williams on a screen talking to you as Robin Williams. And I mean, if it's all right with you, I'm just going to play you just a minute of that, because I've never really seen a trailer quite like it before or since. Feast your ears on this.
I'm Robin Williams, here on the world's largest soundstage at 20th Century Fox. That's right. This entire wheat field is in one building. I'm here tonight to talk to you about an incredible movie, Toys.
Toys trailer. Toys! There'll be a big lettered thing up here above me, glowing. Obviously some incredible special effect that'll go dun 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 dun. Toys! Toys! 아디네 허들이게 비슷네. Boom! Toys! 아디네 허들이가 다스는 이도 그ben나 얘를 혼나세. 아나. 얼른이 신나 어르가만 있어 이거 되네. Not going that way, are we, Sparky?
Toys.
Not the toy maker. I'll be back. Wind me.
Well, it's like Toys in the Hood. Studio executives, in their great insight, said, "You got a movie about toys. When's a good time to bring it out? Rosh Hashanah? No. Christmas!
Wow, beats the hell out of Groundhog Day.
Toys. It's a Barry Levinson movie. Man Who Made Rain Man. Yeah. Raymond, you like toys? Yeah.
Even listening to that, I remember watching it in cinemas at the time. Even listening to that now, it's almost bizarre, and it is putting your key asset front and centre of the film, but almost removing all context outside of the visuals, which obviously you don't get from a podcast, of what the movie is. And I mean, it was sort of a problem that plagued the film when it ultimately got to that release on December the 18th, 1992. And for a big swing movie, and that's why I like talking about, I like big swing movies, sadly, it just wasn't greeted with the critical response that it needed. That, in fact, reviews for it really just were not good at all. As much as some people went out of their way to give credit to Barry Levinson just for trying something, it turned out that his passion project of 12 years or so just wasn't a film that people liked. It was very, very different from what else was out there. That certainly wasn't in its favour. But by the time we were talking about tie-in video games and stuff like that would follow a year later, I mean, its goose was pretty much cooked at that point. The critics needed to give it a lift. This is a film that, had it got word of mouth, really would have aided it. But It didn't get word of mouth. And the problem was it was going out now, this really unusual film, into prime Christmas market. So let's go to that weekend, December the 18th and 20th, 1992. The number one movie was A Few Good Men on its second week of release, $11 million. On its sixth week of release, there's Aladdin, $7.2 million in the bank. What other competition out there? There's Home Alone 2, fifth week of release, $6.8 million in the bank. Then there's Forever Young, Mel Gibson film. One of the first films, might be the first film written by J.J. Abrams, not credited as J.J. Abrams, $5.6 million. I think he's Jeffrey on that, isn't he? Don't hold me to it. I'm freewheeling here. The Bodyguard, that was in fifth place. And then Toys in sixth, just edging out The Muppet Christmas Carol, which had come out the week before. Toys, $4.8 million. And so this wasn't the only film opening with a major comedy star in it either. Leap of Faith, starring Steve Martin, also doing something a little bit left field, opened in ninth place with $3.2 million. I really like Leap of Faith. I like The Distinguished Gentleman that was in the chart as well, $3.7 million, with Eddie Murphy, directed by a Brit, Jonathan Lynn. But, there was a lot of competition, and Toys, it just wasn't happening. By week two, you would hope that the week two was the Christmas weekend. In America, your box office numbers go up as a rule. In fact, I'm looking at the top 10 for the second week here. Everyone's box office numbers either went up, unless it was a new entry, apart from one film in the top 10. That was Toys. It was down to 10th place. Its numbers were down 17%, 3.9 million on its second weekend. Few Good Men, number one. Aladdin, still number two. Aladdin's numbers that weekend, 7 weeks out on release, went up 85%. The new entries in the chart, Jack Nicholson in Hoffa. That in itself, an interesting story. 6.4 million opening, but it wasn't just Robin Williams competing with himself that winter. Jack Nicholson was, because he was in A Few Good Men, top in the chart. He was also in Hoffa, that wasn't top in the chart. And then there's Trespass down in seventh. That also opened. Toys was, it clung on. It clung on in 10th place for one more week, but again, its numbers were just falling, and there was no competition coming out at that point either. It just hadn't found its audience. It just hadn't clicked at all. And its final box office take in the US was I think it came in, $23 million? I'm not sure what it made. I can't find numbers for what it made outside the US, but I can tell you it wasn't an awful lot of money at all. It took a while for it to come to the UK, I remember, and just didn't hang around. It was just one of those films that for whatever reason just didn't click. Well, there's lots of reasons why it didn't click. I've explored some of them, but as Premiere would note I should note it got Oscar recognition, and deserved Oscar recognition for its art direction and costume design. It didn't win them, but at least it picked up a couple of nominations. But as Premiere magazine would note in its April 1994 issue, the scrutiny was now on Barry Levinson. He'd made what was deemed in Hollywood to be a flop movie, and so what do you do next? And so what he actually chose to do, he made two films quite quickly, but the next one was a film called Jimmy Hollywood with Christian Slater that he would go completely the other way. Shot it in 43 days, cost $16 million. It went under the radar, really. But Levinson would say, during that period, I look at Toys and think, I did what I was trying to do. And he said, when you make a film like that, you know you're dealing with no pre-sale, no reference points. And he said, it's dangerous. And producer Mark Johnson would also say, we felt like we had a pariah on our hands. At one point, no one would agree to make the one film Barry really wanted to make. And he just said, we kept using the word whimsy, and the studios were reading it as a black comedy, and black comedies are never profitable. And Johnson says, a part of me actually laments the fact, and this was just ahead of release, that we finally made it. He did say there was something nice about being on the list of the top 10 unproduced screenplays year after year. Toys isn't a film that's had a second life either. It's just an anomaly that just seems to have all but disappeared. And you compare that to something like Aladdin, and Aladdin was, $217 million by the time it left US cinemas. It was in them for an awful long time. So it wasn't a Robin Williams problem, really. It was just the film hadn't particularly clicked. And I mean, Levinson these Robert Emery compilations of interviews, the director's books. I've quoted one of Richard Donner just before, but here's one from volume 3 of those, where Levinson just reflected on toys, and he just said, whenever we screened the movie, it received a really terrific response. But he also said it had more critical attacks than probably anything I'd ever worked on. It was viciously attacked by the critics as being a violent movie, when in reality, no one gets killed in the film. And this was one of the things, that the violence of the movie in a so-called family film, and it talks about violence, certainly, was seen as a problem. Never mind that Home Alone 2 was in the chart, where there's a kid lobbing bricks at people. It was toys that they zeroed in on. As Levinson said, ultimately it was buried. You do the work, you put it out there. And Toys is a film that's still out there, but it is a film that's probably a bit harder to find than it should be, particularly given the talent involved. It is also a film, if you get the opportunity to throw it up on the biggest screen that you can find, just to savour the look of the thing. I mean, we are 30 odd years on from Toys. You're hard pushed to find anything that looks quite like it. And if it doesn't succeed, and I don't really think it succeeds really, it's very much in the noble attempts with a lot of interesting things to look at, even if it doesn't quite hit its targets. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. I am also on Blue Sky at Simon Brew. If you're interested in hearing more of me saying boring things, Film Stories is on Blue Sky at Film Stories. On Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories online, youtube.com/Film Stories. I've mentioned the store.filmstories.co.uk. I haven't mentioned our clickbait-free entertainment website. We're trying really hard to do something that isn't doing what Google algorithms want you to do, which is put loads of clickbaity things and here's everything you need to know about and how to watch this film. I mean, press play. How do you think you watch it? So if you don't mind supporting and helping with that, we're at filmstories.co.uk. We're trying really hard to do something a bit different there. And the Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. I have long outstayed my welcome though. I've long run over. So I'm going to finish as quickly as I can by just saying thank you so much. Thank you for your eardrums. I hope you're safe and well, and I will be back soon with some more film stories. Take care. Bye bye.